What you are about to hear was never supposed to be public, not the threats, not the phone calls, not the pressure, and not the fear, because once you hear what was said behind closed doors, you will never look at this case or the people involved the same way again. This is not gossip, this is power being exposed. And every second you stay with this story, another layer falls apart to get to learn what was said behind closed doors, and what comes out of those conversations changes everything. And before you even have time to process one revelation, another one drops, and then another. And suddenly you realize this is not just another celebrity dispute, this is something darker, something calculated, something that has been quietly unfolding while the public was being distracted by red carpet smiles and carefully curated silence. And it all begins with a simple morning routine, checking the legal docket, expecting maybe a filing or two, and instead finding a flood 40, maybe 50 new documents filed overnight. Some arguing to seal, some demanding to unseal, some fighting over what the public should never see. And buried in the middle of that chaos, something shocking, something that feels less like a mistake and more like a message. Blake Lively's attorney releases the full depositions of Justin Baldoni and Jamie Heath, not excerpts, not summaries, not selected pages, but entire depositions, hundreds of pages long. And included inside those documents are their home addresses. Not redacted, not protected, not hidden, just exposed. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. Because this is not a minor oversight, this is not a clerical error, this is not what happens when tired interns upload the wrong file. This is something seasoned attorneys know better than to do, and that is what makes it so disturbing. Because when people at this level break rules, they usually do it for a reason. And the timing tells you everything. After sealing requests, after setbacks, after control slipping away, suddenly the most sensitive information imaginable becomes public. And the message feels clear: if we are going down, we are taking as much with us as possible. And the cruelty of it is impossible to ignore, because this is coming from the same side that has spent months arguing about privacy, about protection, about third parties, about safety, about emotional harm, and now those same arguments vanish when it suits them. And Justin Baldoni is not some abstract figure, he is a father. He has children, he has a family, and unlike a high-security Manhattan building with guards, cameras, and doormen, he lives in a house, and now anyone with internet access knows exactly where that house is. And this is not paranoia, this is reality, because we live in a time where obsession turns dangerous fast, and the deposition itself confirms why he left Los Angeles, why he disappeared, why he went off grid. He says he took his family to Hawaii, stayed there for a long time, and then moved them to Nashville, not for career reasons, not for lifestyle branding, but for safety. Because once this lawsuit was filed, everything changed, and the exposure of his address blows a hole straight through that attempt at protection. And you have to ask yourself, who benefits from that? Because it certainly is not justice. And then there is the scale of what was released. Justin sat for 2 full days of deposition, more than 23 hours of questioning, 13.5 hours one day, 10 hours the next, while Blake Lively's deposition that we have seen publicly amounts to fragments, half pages carefully controlled. And now suddenly every word Justin spoke is out there, and if that were not enough, the narrative expands even further, because buried inside these pages are conversations that were never meant to be public, conversations that explain why certain decisions were made, why certain people panicked, and why certain threats were taken very seriously. And one of the most revealing moments involves something Blake Lively herself claimed caused her distress, a conversation about her late father. And until now the story has been vague, emotionally charged, framed as inappropriate. But the deposition lays it out plainly. Justin knew her father had passed recently. They had a deep conversation about faith, about what happens after death, about grief and belief. Blake appeared engaged, interested, open, and the next day Justin told her he had prayed for her father and asked for a blessing on the movie. And whether or not you share those beliefs, the intent is clear: comfort, not control, support, not harm. And the setting of that conversation makes the contradiction even louder, because it happened in her office, in her penthouse in Tribeca, the place she herself requested meetings to be held, the place she called Buckingham Palace, a nickname she and Ryan Reynolds reportedly used because of how many celebrities passed through. And the irony is almost unbearable. Someone who claims fear inviting a man alone into her private space, while referring to it with royal grandeur. And that detail matters, because it speaks to power, perception, and ego. And it gets even more layered when Justin mentions that the nickname may have originated with Taylor Swift, which, if true, adds another layer of influence and normalization. And then everything shifts when the deposition turns to recorded phone calls, because Blake's team wants to frame those recordings as illegal. But in doing so, they accidentally unlock what was actually said. And that is where the real tension begins. Jamie Heath recorded a call with WME. Justin was not on it, but he was told about it, and when asked why that call mattered, his answer is chilling. He believed they were being threatened, not vaguely pressured, not nudged, but threatened by Ryan Reynolds and Blake Lively. And when asked how that threat manifested, he explains that demands were being made for him to release a public statement, drafted by Ryan and Blake, a statement that would place full responsibility for the film's promotional backlash on the Wayfarer parties, absolving Blake entirely. And that statement already exists publicly. We know what it says, and we know how devastating it would have been for Justin to sign it, and we know why it was refused. Because even his own wife recognized the trap and said never sign that. And then comes the bombshell: multiple calls from WME conveying that if Justin did not comply, Ryan and Blake would leave the agency, and that is not speculation, that is what Justin says he was told. And when an agent tells you gloves will come off if you do not comply, that is not metaphor. That is leverage, and the question that follows is simple. Were you scared? And Justin answers honestly. He says he was terrified, not because he knew exactly what they would do, but because he knew what they were capable of. He had already seen his movie taken from him, already heard whispers of stories being pitched about him being in a cult, being a predator, being dangerous, and those stories did appear. They appeared in respected publications dressed up as concern and culture analysis. But now with context they look very different, and when someone says gloves off and you know they have access to press agencies, studios, power structures, you do not wait around to find out what comes next, and that fear bleeds into everything else, including the removal of his credit from the poster and act framed by Blake's team as vanity, when in reality it was his right as producer, director, and actor. And the attempt to spin that as ego, as sexism, as male entitlement collapses when you look at the full picture, because this was not about attention, this was about erasure, and the deposition even reveals an attempt to remove him from the trailer itself, which if successful would have erased the male lead from his own film. And when asked whether Blake had approval authority over the final trailer, Justin does not speculate. He points directly to her own letter, where she claimed responsibility for those decisions, a letter she now desperately wants sealed, because it undermines the victim narrative, and every one of these details builds toward the same conclusion. This was not chaos, this was control. And as the sealing battle continues, the Wayfarer parties push back hard, arguing that communications between Ryan Reynolds and WME must be unsealed because Ryan is not a bystander. He inserted himself, he used influence and power, and there is no legitimate privacy interest at stake here, only reputational discomfort. And as more cracks appear, the ripple effects spread outward. Hugh Jackman quietly steps back, distancing himself from Ryan Reynolds. Missed calls, unanswered invitations, ignored attention felt by everyone around them. And when even longtime allies start creating space, it tells you something is shifting. And then there is Colleen Hoover dragged into the storm, choosing sides, retreating, deleting her platform, returning changed, and now revealing a cancer diagnosis linked not to genetics but to lifestyle, stress, environment. And while no one can draw a straight line between legal warfare and illness, the weight of prolonged stress is undeniable, and the cost of this battle is no longer abstract. It is personal, physical, and irreversible, and this is only the beginning. Because now that these depositions are public, the questions will only multiply, the narratives will collide, and the truth will keep pushing its way to the surface, whether anyone is ready for it or not. What makes this next phase even more unsettling is how every new detail reframes what we thought we already understood, because once the curtain is pulled back, you start noticing patterns. Moments that felt random at the time suddenly lock together like pieces of a puzzle, and the deeper you go, the clearer it becomes that this was never just about a movie or hurt feelings or creative differences. It was about leverage, narrative control, and the quiet exercise of power behind friendly smiles and public silence. And as the deposition continues, Justin Baldoni is pressed again and again, not just on facts but on emotions, on intent, on fear, on perception, almost as if the strategy is to exhaust him into contradiction, and yet his answers remain consistent because they are rooted in chronology, not outrage. And that is what gives them weight. He describes learning that his own agency was fielding calls from Ryan Reynolds and Blake Lively, calls that carried an unmistakable undertone: comply or else, and that else was never explicitly spelled out, which made it more frightening. Because when people with reach refuse to name the consequence, you assume it will be devastating. And that fear was not hypothetical. Justin explains that even before the gloves off language, he had already been warned that stories were being pitched about him, that the word cult was being floated, predator insinuated, toxic positivity reframed as manipulation, basic human warmth reframed as threat. And when those stories later appeared, they did not feel like coincidence, they felt like confirmation. And once you understand that sequence, the Hollywood Reporter article reads differently: the tone, the framing, the sources, the timing, it all lines up, and suddenly the idea that this was organic commentary becomes harder to believe. And the deposition then circles back to WME because this is where the pressure crystallized. Justin recounts being told that unless he signed the statement drafted by Ryan and Blake, they would leave the agency, and agencies do not take those threats lightly, especially when they come from marquee names, and this is where the imbalance becomes impossible to ignore because on one side you have a director, producer, actor fighting to keep control of his film, and on the other, you have two megastars with brand empires, representation, power, and media access. And when those forces collide, neutrality disappears, and the agency choice to sever ties with Justin on the same day the New York Times article dropped stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like choreography because maximum impact requires timing. And timing is everything, and Justin says plainly he felt the movie was taken from him, not metaphorically, not emotionally, but practically. Decision stripped, authority removed, credits questioned, image altered, and when asked directly whether he believed Blake Lively had approval authority over creative elements, he points again to her own words, her own letters, her own claims of responsibility. And this matters because it undercuts the portrayal of her as sidelined or powerless, and instead paints a picture of someone deeply embedded in decision-making, someone who knew exactly where leverage points were and how to apply pressure quietly. And then there is the letter to the Producers Guild, a document so sensitive Blake's team is fighting desperately to keep it sealed because it shows her asserting control, not requesting protection, and the irony is staggering because the same legal filings argue she was unsafe, marginalized, unheard, while the letter itself reads like a declaration of authority and influence, and juries notice contradictions like that, which is why sealing battles matter so much here, because once the public sees both narratives side by side, one of them collapses, and that is why the Wayfarer parties are pushing so hard to unseal communications involving Ryan Reynolds, because he is not an incidental spouse or supportive partner, he is an active participant, someone who allegedly drafted statements, threatened agency exits, and spoke directly to power brokers, and that involvement changes the case entirely and explains why his communications are now the most closely guarded pieces of evidence. And outside the courtroom, the fallout continues to spread. Hugh Jackman's distance is not dramatic or public. It is subtle, unanswered calls, missed appearances, quiet absences, but in Hollywood, silence often speaks louder than statements, and sources describe tension, caution, a desire to avoid being pulled into something that feels radioactive. And that word keeps coming up, radioactive, because association now carries risk, and people who once stood comfortably nearby are stepping back for their own preservation. And this pattern mirrors what happened with Taylor Swift, whose silence has become a story in itself, absence as signal, distance as self-protection, and when powerful allies stop showing up, it leaves those at the center exposed. And that exposure coincides with the release of deeply personal information like home addresses, which escalates everything from reputational to physical. And while Blake's team will likely frame that as error, the cumulative context makes that explanation harder to swallow, because this is not the first time boundaries have been crossed. When pressure increases, the tactics escalate, and escalation is what we are watching now. And then the human cost comes back into focus through Colleen Hoover, whose journey through this mess has been visibly painful, choosing sides, deleting platforms, retreating, reemerging, altered, and now revealing a cancer diagnosis tied not to genetics but to lifestyle and stress. And no one is claiming causation, but anyone who has lived through prolonged public conflict knows the toll it takes. And her admission reframes her earlier behavior, not as malice but as someone overwhelmed, caught between forces larger than herself. And yet the question of accountability remains, because harm does not disappear just because the person causing it is also hurting. And this theme runs through the entire saga. Everyone claims damage, everyone claims fear, everyone claims victimhood, but the power dynamics tell a different story. And as Justin explains in the deposition, what scared him most was not a specific threat, but the unknown. He knew they had already tried to shape a narrative about him. He knew they had access to press, legal team, studios, agencies. And when someone like that says gloves off, you prepare for the worst, because you have seen the early stages already play out. And the deposition shows a man bracing for impact, not plotting revenge, not scheming, but trying to survive professionally and personally. And that distinction matters because it goes to intent and credibility. And as these documents continue to surface, the public is being asked to reconcile two very different portrayals, one of calculated dominance and one of alleged victimization. And only one can align with the full factual record, and that is why retention matters here. Because the truth is not in any single headline or clip, it is in the accumulation of details, the sequence, the consistency, and the willingness to sit through hundreds of pages of testimony and connect the dots. And we are only halfway through, because once you understand How the pressure was applied, how the agency was leveraged, how the narrative was seeded. The next question becomes unavoidable. Who else knew, who else participated, and how far this actually went? And those answers are still coming. As the story keeps unfolding, the focus shifts from what was said to how the system responded, because reactions reveal just as much as actions. And when you look at the institutional behavior surrounding this situation, the pattern becomes even clearer. Justin Baldoni describes a moment where everything around him started to move. Without his consent, decisions being made, conversations happening, doors closing, while he was still trying to understand what was happening. And that feeling of losing control is something many people recognize when power dynamics suddenly tilt. And the deposition reflects that slow realization that this was no longer a disagreement that could be resolved privately, but a coordinated pressure campaign playing out across agencies, studios, and media channels. And he explains that after learning about the WME calls the drafted statement and the threat of agency departure, he understood that silence was no longer neutral, because every hour that passed allowed someone else to shape the narrative without him, and yet speaking carried its own risks, because any response could be reframed, misinterpreted, or used as further ammunition. And this is the trap that people with less power often find themselves in. Speak and you confirm the narrative, stay silent and the narrative hardens without you. And the deposition shows him wrestling with that impossible choice, while also trying to protect his family, which is why he emphasizes again and again that his move away from Los Angeles was not strategic branding or career repositioning, but an act of self-preservation. He talks about wanting distance from the noise, from the speculation, from the unknown consequences of those gloves off words, because when you have children, the calculus changes entirely and risk tolerance disappears, and the exposure of his home address directly undermines that effort, making the legal fight suddenly intersect with physical safety. And that is why this detail is not minor, it is central. And when institutions dismiss it as accidental, they ignore the real-world consequences of releasing that information. And the deposition also reveals how incremental the erosion of his role became. First questions about credit, then changes to marketing, then creative decisions that bypassed him, and each step on its own could be framed as normal industry friction, but taken together they form a pattern of displacement. And when Blake Lively's team frames his concern over credit as vanity, the context tells a different story, because credit is not ego. It is ownership, acknowledgement, accountability, and erasing it sends a message about who controls the story and who does not. And this ties directly into the attempted removal of his presence from the trailer, an act that would have symbolically erased him from the public face of the film. And while that effort failed, the fact that it was attempted at all speaks volumes about intent. And the deposition makes clear that Justin perceived these moves not as isolated, but as part of a broader strategy to minimize his visibility and authority while maximizing someone else's. And when asked why he did not push back harder earlier, he explains that the threat environment made every move feel dangerous, because when you believe powerful people are willing to plant stories about you, escalate pressure through agencies, and leverage media relationships, you tread carefully. And that caution has since been reframed as weakness or guilt, but the deposition shows it as fear grounded in experience, not imagination. And then there is the role of documentation, the recordings that Blake Lively's team now attacks as improper, but which Justin frames as defensive, a way to preserve an accurate record in an environment where words were being twisted and intentions misrepresented. And this is a common response when trust erodes. People document because memory becomes contested and documentation becomes survival. And ironically, those recordings are now revealing the very pressure they were meant to protect against, exposing language like gloves off and threats of agency departure that fundamentally change how this story must be understood. And as the legal battle over sealing intensifies, the Wayfarer parties argue that transparency is essential, because the public cannot evaluate credibility without seeing the full record. And they emphasize that sealing is meant to protect private personal information, not shield public figures from embarrassment. And that distinction matters, because once sealing becomes a tool to manage reputation rather than protect safety, it undermines the integrity of the process, and the judge will have to weigh those competing interests, knowing that each decision will shape public perception long before a jury ever hears the case. And outside the courtroom, the social consequences continue to ripple. Alliances shift, silence spreads, and reputations recalibrate. Hugh Jackman's quiet withdrawal is not about choosing sides publicly, but about risk management and emotional boundaries. And sources describe him as exhausted by proximity to chaos, wanting stability while navigating his own personal transitions. And that instinct to step back mirrors what others have done, choosing distance over loyalty. When loyalty becomes costly, and that trend reinforces the idea that this situation has crossed an invisible line, from manageable controversy into something more volatile. And meanwhile, Colleen Hoover's health revelation casts a somber shadow over everything, reminding viewers that behind every headline are real bodies, absorbing stress in ways that are not always visible. And while no one can assign blame, the acknowledgement that lifestyle and stress played a role underscores how destructive prolonged conflict can be. And it complicates simplistic narratives of villains and heroes, because suffering does not distribute evenly and accountability does not erase empathy. And as the deposition nears its later sections, Justin articulates the core of his fear: not fame, loss, or criticism, but falsehood, the idea that lies could become accepted truth through repetition, amplification, and authority. And in an industry where perception often outweighs fact, that fear is rational. And his testimony repeatedly returns to the same theme: uncertainty. He did not know what they would do, only that they had already done some of it. And that not knowing is what kept him up at night and drove his decisions. And as viewers, we are being asked to sit with that discomfort, to resist the urge for easy conclusions and instead follow the evidence where it leads, even when it challenges popular narratives, because this story is not about one explosive moment. It is about accumulation, pressure, escalation, and the quiet machinery of influence. And we are not at the end yet, because as more documents are reviewed, more communications unsealed, and more participants speak, the picture will continue to sharpen, and the question will not be who said what, but who had the power to make it matter. As everything converges in this final stretch, the weight of what has been revealed begins to settle, and the story stops feeling like a collection of shocking moments and starts reading like a map of how influence actually works when no one is watching. Because what Justin Baldoni's deposition ultimately exposes is not just a dispute between individuals, but a system that responds predictably when pressure is applied from the right direction. And he describes watching institutions bend, not abruptly, but subtly. Phone calls returned faster, meetings scheduled sooner, decisions framed as mutual when they were anything but. And that quiet shift is often invisible to the public, yet unmistakable to the person experiencing it. And he explains that once the threat environment became clear, once the language of gloves off entered the conversation, every interaction felt loaded, every delay felt intentional, and every concession felt like a step closer to losing something he had built. And what stands out is how often he emphasizes confusion rather than anger. He did not understand why the escalation was happening at the scale it was, why disagreements that could have been handled internally suddenly required agency, ultimatums, and media positioning. And that confusion underscores the asymmetry of information at play, because while one side appeared to know exactly what levers to pull, the other was left reacting, trying to interpret signals while the ground shifted beneath him. And this is where the narrative of intent becomes crucial, because intent is what distinguishes conflict from coercion. And the deposition repeatedly returns to moments where Justin says he was not informed, consulted, or included in decisions that directly affected his role and reputation. And exclusion is a form of power, especially when it is strategic and layered on top of reputational threat. And that exclusion extended beyond creative decisions into the public narrative, where stories about his character, beliefs, and behavior circulated without his input, and were then treated as established context rather than allegations. And the cumulative effect of that is isolation, because once a narrative hardens, dissent becomes suspect, and silence becomes interpreted as confirmation. And Justin describes feeling trapped by that dynamic, unable to respond without feeding the story, yet unable to stay quiet without losing control of it entirely. And this is where the legal process became his only remaining avenue, not as a weapon but as a shield, a place where facts could be documented, timelines established, and statements tested under oath, rather than filtered through press cycles. And the irony is that now that those depositions are public, the same side that argued for transparency is fighting to limit access, because the sworn testimony does not align cleanly with the public narrative that had been advanced. And that tension between on-record statements and off-record impressions is where credibility is decided, and the fight over sealing becomes not just procedural, but symbolic, a struggle over who gets to define reality. And the Wayfarer party's argument that the public interest outweighs reputational discomfort resonates, because this is not a private dispute between unknown parties. This involves major public figures, agencies, studios, and media outlets, whose behavior has broader implications for how power is exercised. And when Ryan Reynolds' communications with WME are framed as private, it ignores the fact that those communications allegedly shaped professional consequences for others. And once actions have public impact, the expectation of secrecy weakens. And this is why the push to unseal is so Relentless because the truth of influence rarely survives behind closed doors. And outside the courtroom, the social recalibration continues with increasing visibility. Ryan Reynolds reaching out, Hugh Jackman not responding, a dynamic that flips the public image of effortless camaraderie into something strained and one-sided. And that shift matters because in Hollywood, alliances are currency, and when someone stops returning calls, it signals more than personal distance, it signals reputational risk, and that risk calculation appears to be spreading because silence from other associates grows louder by the day, and silence in this context is not neutrality, it is avoidance, and avoidance suggests that whatever is coming next is something people do not want to be adjacent to, and that anticipation hangs over everything. Because this story is still unfolding, documents still being reviewed, testimony still being contextualized, and narrative still being tested, and the exposure of home addresses marks a line that once crossed cannot be uncrossed because it transforms legal conflict into something more personal, more dangerous, and more irreversible. And whether or not that exposure was intentional, its impact is undeniable, and it reframes arguments about safety and harm in a way that no legal brief can fully contain. And as the deposition closes, Justin returns again to the idea of fear, not fear of criticism, but fear of distortion, fear that his actions would be permanently redefined by people with louder microphones and deeper connections. And that fear is not unique to him, it is something many experience when confronting institutional power, and that universality is what gives this story resonance beyond celebrity gossip, because it asks uncomfortable questions about who gets believed, who gets protected, and who bears the cost when narratives are manufactured rather than examined. And as viewers and observers, the responsibility is not to choose sides reflexively, but to pay attention to patterns, to consistency, to motive, and to consequence. Because those are the markers that distinguish truth from theater. And the reason this story refuses to fade is because it touches something fundamental about fairness, accountability, and the fragility of reputation in a system that rewards influence over evidence. And this final section does not close the book. It simply brings us to the edge of what comes next, because with each unsealed document, each corroborated timeline, and each quiet withdrawal by former allies, the structure holding the original narrative together weakens, and once that structure collapses, it will not be rebuilt with spin or silence, it will be replaced by record testimony, documented pressure, and the undeniable weight of what was said. When people thought no one would ever hear it, this story is no longer about rumors or personalities. It is about power, pressure, and what happens when private influence is dragged into public light. Every document, every deposition, every sudden silence tells us this was never accidental. And as more records are unsealed, the truth becomes harder to outrun. What was said behind closed doors is now part of the record, and once that happens, there is no spinning it back, because the gloves were taken off long ago. And now everyone is being forced to stand in the open and answer for what they did when they thought no one was watching.